A showdown between East and West. As the EU and the US face off against Russia over NATO and Ukraine, Beijing and Moscow strengthen their cooperation. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today on The Newsmakers, we'll ask if East-West Cold War-style alliances are forming again. EU leaders have reaffirmed their support for Kiev, threatening new sanctions if Moscow continues amassing troops on the Ukrainian border. Earlier this month, the U.S. warned that Russia could launch an incursion into eastern Ukraine in the new year. The Kremlin denies the allegations, saying Russia would never invade, but it will respond to threats. The EU has condemned what it calls Russia's aggressive stance.
And at this point in time, Russia is choosing an aggressive posture vis-à-vis its neighbors. And as the European Union and its G7 partners have made very clear, further aggressive acts against Ukraine will have massive costs for Russia.
But how far is the EU willing to go? It already has some sanctions in place against Russia, implemented in the wake of the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Now, the West imposed financial sanctions and trade restrictions, as well as a ban on assistance to Russian oil and gas companies. However, critics say they've failed to contain Putin's apparent ambitions in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russia has issued its own demands to de-escalate the standoff, including a promise that no former Soviet republics will be admitted into NATO, and the removal of NATO troops and weapons from Eastern European countries that have joined the alliance since 1997. Moscow says it's now urgently waiting for a response. This week also marks 30 years since the Soviet Union's collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev resigned, and as the USSR dissolved, former states became independent republics like Ukraine. Today, though, some fear that Putin is trying to return Moscow to some of its former Soviet glory, and China might be willing to lend a helping hand. Last week, President Putin and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping agreed to stand firm together in rejecting Western pressure. They pledged to defend each other's security interests. To many, their conversation underscored how a shared hostility to the West has brought Moscow and Beijing closer together.
At present, certain international forces are arbitrarily interfering in the internal affairs of China and Russia under the guise of democracy and human rights, and brutally trampling on international law and the norms of international relations.
So are we seeing new axes form that could mark a return to the Cold War? To discuss that and more, I'm joined now from Moscow by Andrei Fedorov. He is former deputy foreign minister and a member of President Putin's advisory team. Peter Zalmayev joins us now from Kiev. He's the director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. And in Milan is Eleonora Tafuro Ambrosetti. She is a research fellow specializing in Russia at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Thanks all so much for being with us. It's a bit hard to deny that what's happening in Ukraine right now doesn't at least echo the Cold War divides. But still, while some argue it's an obvious thing, others are saying it's very dangerous to draw those kinds of parallels. Peter, let me start with you. Where do you stand?
Well, I think that the return to this Cold War mentality was inaugurated by Vladimir Putin himself in 2007 when he delivered the so-called Munich speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he criticized what he called the United States' monopolistic dominance in global relations and America's almost uncontained hyper-use of international relations. I'm quoting him directly. In response, the NATO secretary called that speech unhelpful. And so that in turn led to a series of recriminations flying back and forth and very, very unhelpful downward spiral of rhetoric on both sides of the Atlantic. In fact, I would say that Vladimir Putin continues to want a return to the Cold War mentality of a dual power competition, which would put Russia on par with the United States. But Russia is no longer the Soviet Union. It does not have its ideology, and its economy is the size of Holland. It's very modest. And so the US is really competing against China and not against Russia, and Vladimir Putin is really not happy about that.
Okay, let me ask Andrei Fedorov. I mean, did Putin start this then in 2007 because he wanted to return Russia to something closer to its superpower status?
First of all, I would like to stress that today we are already in the situation of Cool War. And Cold War, from my point of view, is coming, and coming quite soon, especially if United States and NATO will reject recent proposals from Russia on security guarantees. We are now very much close to the repetition of the situation of the end of 80s, when there was a danger of real military clash and all these Pershing missiles and all these other things. The problem today is that Russia wants to have such kind of guarantees which are, at this stage, are unacceptable for United States and NATO. And this battle for guarantees might be a road to a new Cold War.
Okay, might be a road to a new Cold War, but during the actual Cold War, Andrei, we never saw conflict, military conflict, between the powers themselves. We saw a lot of conflict break out via proxy. So how do you see the military conflict, if it plays out in similar fashion to the Cold War? How would you see that potentially playing out today with these circumstances?
It seems to me that there are two scenarios. First scenario is what I call banana skin scenario. It's linked with the situation around Ukraine, which is really unpredictable and which can blow up any moment, though personally I've gotten information from Kiev that we should not worry at least till the mid of January. This is good. The second scenario is that, as I mentioned previously, if NATO and the United States will reject recent Russian proposals, Putin can declare, and it's quite possible that he will make it this Thursday already, he will declare some military measures which will put us on the edge of Cold War.
Can you expand on that? What are you expecting to happen on Thursday? What exactly might he announce?
Thursday is an annual press conference of Putin, annual, usually 4 hours long press conference. And on this press conference, he will devote a lot of time to the security situation around Russia, to Ukraine, to relationship with the United States and NATO.
Okay. Peter, what does that make you think of there? What do you...
So
Go ahead.
Some people are saying that he can repeat, things which will sound same like it was in Munich.
Very interesting. Mm-hmm. Peter, what does that make you think of? What are your concerns
Well, first
now?
of all,
Go ahead.
First of all, the red line that Vladimir Putin is drawing is he's boxing himself into a corner. Obviously, it's a matter of face saving for him, because he drew a line purposefully, in my opinion, that will be unacceptable to the Europeans, to NATO members, to the US, who said that no third party has any prerogative to rule out another country's membership in the NATO alliance. So Vladimir Putin knows that is a red line that's unacceptable. He's doing it. It seems like he's doing it as a pretext to start a military action in Ukraine, which seems to be predetermined. And once again, the ultimatum that Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, proposed to NATO is based ultimately on misinformation. The Russians are claiming that in the 90s, the Bush senior administration, in the form of James Baker, the Secretary of State at that time, promised to the Soviets not to expand, or to Russians, not to expand NATO to former countries of the former Soviet Union. Well, none other than Mikhail Gorbachev has later disavowed that information, saying that there was no such promise. So the very premise of Russia's ultimatum is based essentially on a lie.
Let me get Eleonora's thoughts on all of this, because Eleonora, I know you've said you really don't like hearing these comparisons with the Cold War. This isn't the same as what we saw in history. Now, Ukraine might not be the Cuban Missile Crisis, but a lot of people argue if you fail to see the parallels here, we could be bound to repeating the same mistakes and having failed to learn from the past. Go ahead.
Exactly. I think every historic event is unique, but we can draw some conclusions from the study of such unique events. And one thing that Peter highlighted very well is that, conditions today are different in terms of the two superpowers capacities and in terms of the lack of ideology. But I think one thing remained the same, the need for an enemy. And this applies to Russia as well as to NATO. I mean, both of them need an external enemy around which can rally the flag, basically. So I think this is a pretty dangerous situation, and the efforts to de-escalate should focus also on these political narratives that are then spread internally as well. In terms of Ukraine, yes, the one element that makes this situation very dangerous is that it's volatile, and signs can also misinterpret it and can lead to a chain of events that could be very difficult to stop at some point.
Interesting, Eleonora, to point out that you think the parties involved have a need for an enemy. But Andrei, let me put this to you, because what's truly arguably different this time is China's place now in this, and is really seeing the warmth between Presidents Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin at their last video conference, their stances on non-interference. At this point, do you think it's a step too far to say that this could be a strategic match made in heaven as per how they could protect each other's interests, having some of the most powerful militaries in the world between them?
I would like to stress that during this conversation between Putin and Xi Jinping, a lot of time have been spent for discussion on security and defense issues. And one formula which was mentioned by our Chinese friends even before this conversation is that both sides should think about so-called situation alliance. It means that in certain circumstances, both countries could act together both in military area as well as in political area. And the whole situation now, frankly speaking, is pushing Russia to have more close ties with China. And during coming visit of Putin to Beijing, early February, this topic of joint efforts in a struggle against U.S. expansion or U.S. aggressive policy, as Xi Jinping mentioned, will be a priority.
Andrei, let me ask you, I mean, there could be a lot to gain for Russia and China with strengthening this kind of relationship. Why has it taken this long?
First of all, the problem is that China feels itself quite independent in such things, and they don't want to tie their hands with a certain kind of military union with Russia. China would like to have their hands free, to act freely on cases like Taiwan, etc. But now, with the situation of AUKUS, Quad and many other things, difficult relations between Russia and Japan, China and Japan, things might change. And a kind of military coalition a military-oriented coalition can be formed quite soon.
Peter, let me ask you, I mean, from the Ukrainian perspective, how you feel about that. You know, China hasn't recognized, for example, Crimea, but Russia hasn't recognized Taiwan. But in this context, those would seem relatively kind of simple asks from either party in order to really strengthen their ties. And to have that kind of military, strategic kind of military alliance, what would that mean, not just for Ukraine, but for the West and the world?
Well, I mean, before we even go there, I think the very fact that you have asked that why is it taking so long speaks volumes about how the two sides, China and Russia, are somewhat suspicious of each other. I would even say Russia is more so suspicious of China. Obviously, the West is really competing against China, not so much as against Russia, and that has bred some sort of resentment on the part of Vladimir Putin. Russia is a junior partner in this tandem with China, and it's clear to me, at least, that ordinary Russians are at least as suspicious about China's intentions in Russia as they are about the U.S. China is exporting labor force around the world through its One Road and One Belt initiative. It's exporting its labor to the Russia's Far East to the point where there is a significantly changing demographic in the Far East region of Russia with mixed marriages with Chinese nationals, etc. And that's very, very concerning. Russia is encroaching also on Russia's so-called near abroad, former republics of Central Asia, such as Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. It seems to have free reign when it comes to its spies and security agents in those countries, hunting down Uyghur activists in those countries. And once again, don't forget that Russia is, while it's considered a hybrid as far as being whether it is a European or an Asian culture, it's probably sees itself more of a European civilization rather than Asian. And so that complicates a full flowering of relations between China and Russia. And once again, don't forget the recent history, relatively recent history, as early as 1960s, when there was a border war between these two countries. So while this is a strategically, kind of a tactically, I would say, important relationship for these two parties, Russia is very wary of, rushing headlong into China's embrace.
Okay, let me just quickly ask Andrei if you agree there with Peter's take. Okay, unfortunately, it seems Andrei couldn't hear Peter's assessment there, but let me turn to Eleonora, because I could see you did agree with much of what Peter was saying. Right now, we know China and Russia haven't declared any kind of formal alliance. Are you as suspicious as Peter as to that happening? Likely it won't, he thinks.
Well, in 2005, a famous Russian analyst said that the alliance between Russia and China resembled an alliance between a rabbit and a boa constrictor. And almost 20 years after, I can see that the risk is there and the Kremlin sees it. But the problem is that yes, both of them are having very difficult relationship with the West, and that draws them together. But also, Russia is following a worldwide tendency. Everybody is focusing more on China because China is projected to become the biggest superpower in the world, surpassing the United States, according to some estimates, already in 2028. So Russia is not doing anything different from other countries, including the US, that are pivoting to Asia.
Okay. Andrei, I'm hoping you could at least hear that last commentary. And it's interesting, the
Yes.
rabbit and a boa constrictor comparison. Are Russia and China still on those lines there, or do you think things have changed now and that Russia and China could actually see a lot more strength and cooperation going forward?
Yes, we have differences with China. We have some problems with China. There are a lot of people in the Russian elite who is being afraid that Russia might be a hostage of China, but at the same time, the principle is the following: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We have no other option than cooperate with China, because unfortunately, during the last years, Russia turned much more into what I call lone wolf policy. And in this situation, we need partners, and China is more or less the partner which we can trust, at least at this very moment. Of course, it's not an easy partner. I can agree that in certain way, Russia is a junior partner, but it's a partner, and we have strategic relations. And the question is what kind of form, what kind of alliance might appear during the coming visit of Putin to China? How far Russia and China will go together against the United States?
What are your instincts telling you? How far do you think that relationship could grow? And if you can, comment on the actual personal relationship between Xi Jinping and President Putin. It did seem quite warm. There were a lot of smiles and kind of brotherly greetings between the two. Was that for the cameras, or is there a warmth there?
No, it's a very good personal relations, and it's the usual strategy of Putin. He always put a lot of weight on personal relations. It's his traditional strategy, like it was especially in Europe with Angela Merkel, etc., etc. And that's why, by the way, he is also now trying to build up personal contact with Joe Biden, which is also not so easy. But with Xi Jinping, he can feel himself quite comfortable, absolutely.
Okay. Peter, let me come back to you, because it's really on Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine really is, like I said, it's not the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it is the flashpoint. Ukraine has said it wants to talk directly to the Kremlin, but the Kremlin has said, no, we're not talking directly until you basically acknowledge that Crimea is ours, and then we can discuss relations. So right now, those talks are not on the table, but it's still what President Zelensky is pushing for. Do you feel that there is potential there for that to happen? That's just a matter of diplomacy before at least that step can be taken and this situation can be de-escalated?
Well, I think it's ultimately up to Vladimir Putin. He's calling the shots, considering that Zelensky has made it clear that he's willing to meet with Vladimir Putin, which is very risky for him, considering the domestic sort of, situation here. Zelensky's opposition is claiming that he's just not ready to go head to head with Vladimir Putin as a much less experienced politician than Vladimir Putin. So it's very, very risky, considering that Putin really knows how to charm his interlocutors into saying things they later regret. But once again, this is another, I think, tactic by the Kremlin to oppose such negotiating positions where they know the opposing side is simply not ready to accept. To want Ukraine to recognize Russia's sovereignty over the Crimean Peninsula is a non-starter. No Ukrainian president can give Russia what it wants when it comes to Crimea and remain president for long. It's an absolute red line. And once again, we're seeing Vladimir Putin being very obstructionist. So all signs are pointing towards Russia's willingness to escalate into war in Ukraine, unfortunately.
That is unfortunate. Eleonora, go ahead.
No, I think obviously some of the conditions that Russia puts are unacceptable for many partners, including, of course, Ukraine and the US. But at least there are clear negotiating positions. And of course, not all of them will be met, but some of them could be discussed upon. And I think this is very important because when Peter was talking about the promises that the West made to Russia in terms of NATO enlargement, well, this is a very fierce historiographic debate, actually. And there are sources quoted from the George Washington University saying that actually there was a lot of ambiguity when the Soviet Union fell. And Reagan, as well as other high-level politicians from the US and from Europe, promised actually Russia that NATO would not enlarge. So here there is a big debate, and we shouldn't give things for granted.
Okay.
At least we have clear positions here that we can build on.
Fair enough. Andrei, just a couple minutes left. I want to get your final thoughts.
First of all, I would like to say that our relationship with Ukraine is very difficult now. And we can expect any time that it can turn into a confrontation. That's why Putin's position is very clear. Russia will never attack Ukraine if there will be no provocations from Ukrainian side. But if, for example, Ukrainian army will attack Donbass, Russia will use its regular military forces to defend Donbass, also because there are already now 650,000 citizens with Russian passports. So that's why it's one of the obstacles for meeting between Putin and Zelensky, because it's a clear position of Putin that he will not meet Zelensky if there will be Crimea issue on the agenda. That's why I was recently spoke with my friends in Kiev and said that the only possibility to have a meeting is to have so-called free flow agenda. So without fixing the holes in the beginning.
Okay. Andrei Fedorov, I will have to give you the last word. Very unfortunately, we are out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember, you can always follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers. And be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.